The Biblical Times Podcast. Writer and editor, Dr. Leora Ravid. Narration, David Green. Judah and Tamar Affair. The first episode out of 3. Episode 10. Hello to all our listeners, and thanks for joining us for the next 3 episodes dedicated to the story of Judah and Tamar, as told in chapter 38 of the book of Genesis. The heroine of this affair is a very young widow named Tamar, who defied all the social and legal norms that prevailed in Israel around 1700 BCE. Tamar intentionally violated one of the strictest incest prohibitions in the Bible. The punishment for the horrific crime she committed was execution. But Tamar's story teaches us that when the law clashes with natural justice, justice prevails. This is the story of Tamar and Judah. Archaeological excavations conducted in the land of Israel over the last 60 years have revealed hundreds of small villages, each likely inhabited by no more than 10 to 20 extended families. In one of these tiny agricultural villages lived Judah, the 4th son of Jacob and Leah, after whom the tribe of Judah was named. Judah had a flock of sheep which he entrusted to a man named Hirah, who lived in a remote settlement called Timnah. Every year at the beginning of summer, Judah would come to Timnah to shear his sheep's wool, and this was also the case in the year in which our story began. In Timnah lived a man named Shua, who was of Canaanite descent. Shua had a daughter whose name the Bible does not reveal, so she was referred to as the daughter of Shua. Judah married her, and the couple had 3 sons, Onan and Shelah. Years passed. The daughter of Shua passed away, and their eldest son, reached marriageable age. He was probably around 13 years old, which is the age of sexual awakening for boys. Judah married him to a girl named Tamar, who was likely around 11 years old, which was the acceptable age of marriage for girls who lived in the ancient world, as we talked about in episode 7. Tamar, who had never met before, left her family, which lived in Timnah, and went to live with her young husband in Judah's home. If everything had proceeded as desired, and Tamar would have grown up together. A few years after their marriage, they would have had children. Had everything proceeded as desired, when the time came, would have inherited his father's place and estate. But the story is progressing in a bad and undesirable way, because almost immediately after their marriage, God put to death. Since died childless, Judah ordered Onan, his second son, to marry Tamar and give her a son. Quote, "Then Judah said to Onan, 'Sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother.' As he was ordered, Onan married Tamar, but the Lord put him to death too." The question of why God killed and Onan will be discussed at length in the 3rd episode of this series. In the meantime, to understand why Judah married Tamar to his second son, we must pause the course of the story and explain the levirate law, according to which Judah acted. Today, a woman whose husband has passed away is a free woman who is entitled to lead her life as she pleases. But in ancient times, a married woman was owned by her husband, and if he died, the ownership of her remained in the hands of his family. Therefore, the widow was not allowed to leave her dead husband's house. If the widow already had children, then she fulfilled her duty to her deceased husband. Her children contributed to the resilience of his family and ensured her place. If she was still a young woman who could bear children, most likely one of her husband's relatives would have married her. Her second marriage would have allowed her to restore her life, and of course, if she had given birth to her second husband, her status would have been even further strengthened. The situation of a widow without children was quite different. In such a case, the husband's brother was obligated to follow the levirate law, marry the widow, and have her bear a son who would be considered the eldest son of the deceased. In some ways, the levirate law resembles surrogacy, except that here we are not talking about a woman giving birth to a child for another woman, but about a brother who fathers a child as an heir to his dead brother. Therefore, Judah followed the law when he married Tamar to his second son. Quote, "Sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother." The levirate law may seem shocking to us. We cannot accept the fact that a widow remains under the authority of her dead husband's family. We refuse to accept a law that compels the brother-in-law to marry his brother's widow. However, it's important to remember that this story doesn't relate to modern Western society in the 21st century, but rather to the reality of thousands of years ago. The levirate law, which is at the center of Tamar and Judah's story, was a progressive law designed to benefit the deceased's family, and most importantly, the widow. In episode 7, we explained why the Bible encouraged polygamy and why the practice of marrying many wives was common throughout the ancient world. And we also discussed why the woman's only duty was to bear children for her husband. And yet, although the Bible treats polygamy positively, it forbids men to have sexual contact with women who are first related to them. Chapters 18 and 20 of Leviticus define in clear terms that a man is forbidden to have sex with his mother, his sisters, and his granddaughters. It is also forbidden for a man to have sexual relations with his father's wives and for a father to have sexual relations with his son's wives. Let us read only the prohibition that is relevant to our story. Do not have sexual relations with your brother's wife. That would dishonor your brother. Leviticus 18:16. Chapter 20 says, if a man marries his brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has dishonored his brother. They will be childless. The incest prohibitions in Leviticus are forever permanent and never permissible. Anyone who violates these prohibitions will be considered a criminal who committed an abominable act, and his punishment would be death. However, although the Bible forbids a brother to have sex with his sister-in-law, the book of Deuteronomy establishes one exception, which exists only on the condition that the deceased dies childless. This law is called the levirate law. Quote, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. Deuteronomy 25, 5-6. The law that allowed one of the strictest prohibitions against incest in the Bible was intended to benefit everyone, especially the widow. Let us prove our point. Of course, the deceased couldn't be brought back to life. However, if his widow married his brother and bore him children, then his family would not have lost the children she would have given birth to had he been alive. And that is one important gain. The second gain is that of the deceased himself who died childless. According to the levirate law, the first child born by his brother to his widow would be considered his son and heir. And this is the practical meaning of the sentence. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. The levirate law only applies to the eldest son. If the widow and the brother-in-law had more children, those children would be considered the offspring of their biological father. Finally, the most significant benefit was for the widow who remained owned by her dead husband's family. Deuteronomy explicitly states that she will not marry outside the family of her dead husband. The widow must not marry outside the family. In this situation, the only way the widow could rebuild her life was to marry her brother-in-law and have children with him. In addition, this was the only way she could fulfill her duty to her late husband and give him offspring. Now the levirate law has been clarified, we can return to our story. Since Tamar's first husband died childless, the condition for the levirate law was met, and it explains why Judah had to marry her to his second son Onan. And since Onan also died childless, an unusual situation arose in which he had to remarry Tamar to his third son Shelah, with the aim that she would give birth to two sons. One son would be considered Er's son, and a second one would be considered Onan's. The Bible indicates that Judah did indeed intend to implement the law, but since Shelah was still a young boy who had not yet reached marriageable age, and since he was afraid that Shelah's fate would be the same as that of his brothers, he ordered Tamar to return to her father's home. Quote, Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. In terms of our time, at about the age of 13, when our daughters attended elementary school, Tamar was married and widowed twice. This unfortunate fact illustrates once again the huge gap between Western modern society and the ways of life that were customary in the ancient world. And this unfortunate way of life continues in third world countries. As per Judah's instruction, Tamar returned to her father's house and waited for Shelah to grow up and marry her. In the meantime, a year passed, and then another year, and then many years passed. Eventually, Tamar had to face the fact that Judah had broken his promise. Not only that, she realized that he didn't intend to let her go free of his grasp and allow her to marry another man other than Shelah. As a result, Tamar became an anchored wife, in Hebrew, a guna. An anchored wife is a married and unmarried woman at the same time. She is stuck in a marriage that is not taking place in the present and is not expected to be consummated in the future. Like an anchored boat, she cannot free herself from the chains that prevent her from continuing her life. We must emphasize that since Tamar was promised to marry Shelah, she was considered a married woman. But when Judah decided to break his promise and keep her under his authority, she became an anchored wife. If she had chosen to marry or have sex with another man besides Shelah, she would have been considered an adulteress wife and sentenced to death. The book of Deuteronomy that established the law was aware of the possibility that the brother-in-law may refuse to obey it. So the book specifies what the punishment of the refuser will be. Because the punishment is relevant to what we're going to say, let us read it. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, "My husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me." Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, "I do not want to marry her," his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, "This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line." That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. Deuteronomy 25, 7-10. In a traditional tribal society where women had inferior legal status compared to men, there was hardly anything more humiliating than a public contempt ceremony in which a woman spat in the face of a man who refused to obey the elders' orders. The law we just read describes the legal system of a tribal society where the elders served as the leaders of their clan. The elders acted as judges for their family members, but their authority was limited to the tribe to which they belonged. Ostensibly, it was the time for Tamar to go to the city gate and ask for the elders' help. Ostensibly, she could have asked them to summon Judah and order him to keep the promise he gave many years ago, or to force him to relinquish his ownership of her. Unfortunately for Tamar, this was impossible because after Onan's death, she returned to her father's home who lived in Timnah. And since the authority of the elders of Timnah was limited to the families they governed, they could not help her. From the story, Tamar found herself in a situation where she could not receive any legal assistance to escape Judah's iron grasp, and in the meantime, the years passed. One day, Tamar found out that Judah had come to Timnah to shear the flock of sheep he kept there, and this was her chance. Tamar realized that if she didn't get up and save her life, she would remain living as an anchor wife in her father's house until her last day. Tamar summoned up the courage to do something that would not be done. She removed her widow's clothes and disguised herself as a prostitute. After completing her disguise, she covered her face with a veil and set out to ambush Judah by the side of the road. Quote, Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep." She took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, for she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." Genesis 38, 13-16. Judah fell into a trap set by Tamar, and since he had to pay the mysterious prostitute for her services, he promised to give her a young goat from his herd. But because he did not carry a goat with him, as collateral, Tamar demanded that in the meantime he would give her his seal and the cord that tied it to his neck and the staff he held in his hand. Tamar did not disguise herself as a prostitute to get a little goat. She slept with Judah to conceive a child with him. The seal and the cord and the staff were proof of with whom she had conceived. Tamar's act is shocking, and there is no doubt that she hid her identity, proving that she was aware that she deliberately violated one of the strictest incest prohibitions in the Bible. A prohibition that never under any circumstances is permitted. Quote, "Do not have sexual relations with your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. Do not have relations with her that would dishonor you." Leviticus 15. Chapter 20 says, "If a man has sexual relations with his daughter-in-law, both of them are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads." Tamar did what she did because she had nothing to lose. She returned to her father's house, and Judah finished his business in Timnah and returned to his home, and the mysterious prostitute was forgotten from his memory. 3 months passed, and then, one fine afternoon, the sky fell on his head with a mighty thud. Judah heard that his daughter-in-law had committed adultery and become pregnant by a stranger. She had degraded him in front of all those who knew him. Shocked by the scandalous act done by his brazen daughter-in-law, Judah never imagined that there might be a connection between Tamar, who had blossomed in his memory many years ago, and the prostitute who had blossomed from his memory only 3 months ago. In his rage, he rushed into the field to collect dry twigs for the bonfire in which he would burn his adulterous daughter-in-law. Quote, "As Tamar was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. 'I am pregnant by the man who owns these,' she said. And she added, 'See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are.' Judah recognized them and said, 'She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah,' and he did not sleep with her again." There is no doubt that the law was on Judah's side, but surprisingly, instead of executing Tamar, he admitted that she was right. He returned her to his home, and she gave birth to the twins Perez and Zerah. Now, after many years of sorrow, Tamar finally had a family and a life. Nonetheless, her seemingly happy ending raises a long list of legal, social, and moral questions. The first question is why Tamar was not executed despite the grave crime she committed, as required by the law. Another question is what her legal status was after she returned to Judah's home. The most important question is why Judah, who represents the position of the Bible, justifies what she did but never sleeps with her anymore. We will answer these questions in the next episode, where we will also prove that the story of Judah and Tamar establishes a supreme moral lesson. When the rigid law clashes with justice, justice triumphs. Before we part, we must mention that it would be difficult to record additional episodes without our listeners' support. Producing this podcast is particularly expensive due to the need to translate it from Hebrew, the original language of the Bible, and the need for assistance from various professionals. If you'd like to support this unique project, you can do so by going to our website and selecting one of the options that appear there. Those interested in purchasing Dr. Ravid's book, Daily Life in Biblical Times, can do so through our podcast's website. The book examines the actions of biblical heroes, considering the social and legal norms that existed in their time, which obligated them to act in the way they did. Ravid's book contains translations of numerous puns and wordplays that offer additional insights into the stories, which are lost in the English translation. Please recommend our podcast to your friends and relatives, and until next time, goodbye and all the best.